Hi everyone, this is a course review for the Implementing Policy and Regulation in Educational Settings course. This is the first video of several that will go through the different topics we've covered as the course has progressed. You'll need to watch all the videos in order to conduct a complete review of the semester's content. First up, we're going to cover the origins of policy and the components of the policy-making process, and then how educational policy is different from other policy-making types. So in terms of the origins of policy, you may recall that we talked about policy-making coming from many different areas. It can be top-down or bottom-up. It can be from problems in a society, and that there are different components of the policy-making process. I'll show a graph in a minute that shows the outline of the different stages of the policy-making process. So in terms of the policy, making public policy, this chart shows that cyclical drawing that I put up on the whiteboard at the beginning of the semester that talks about there's a problem. It starts with the yellow box that there is a problem identified, and the agenda setting stage is where that problem goes from being just a known problem to being a problem that is considered by decision makers. In other words, it gets put on the agenda. This can be by lawmakers, or it can be by other people in a position to solve the problem or to make choices about solutions. And from there we move into the policy-making process. So once a problem has been identified that is going to be investigated, then it goes into the policy-making process where alternatives are identified. Then the budgeting process is where a cost analysis is conducted and decisions are made about how much to invest in what kind of solutions. Then from the budgeting process to the implementation process, a solution is selected and it is implemented in response to this problem. The implementation phase, of course, can be affected by any of these other phases of the public policy process, but the implementation phase is really just one step in many throughout this cycle. Once a policy solution has been implemented, the next step, as with all educational programs, is to evaluate. In other words, what were the outcomes of this policy that was implemented? We want to know if it has fully solved the problem. And if so, great. But if not, then you're back at stage one to see what is the new problem that exists. Sometimes policy solutions can completely solve a problem, and sometimes they only partially solve the problem. In other words, this is a cyclical process that continues on perpetually, so that the existence of a problem is identified and it goes forward with new opportunities for solutions. This is on a perpetual basis. Now, looking at one of our early readings that's specifically about the education policy-making process, the Haddad and Dembski reading laid it out very clearly. Educational policy planning is not the result of a bunch of random events. It doesn't just happen without guidance. Policy itself is either a single decision or a series of decisions that guide future decision making. They can start or stop actions or activities, and they can also provide guidance for the implementation of previous decisions or previous policies. So policy itself doesn't have a very tight definition because it is by need it is a set of guidance, or it is a method or mechanism for providing guidance for activities and decision making. So it can be big or small, it can be simple or complex, and we'll look at that as we did earlier in the semester. Some of the important takeaways, if you consider policy, you'll recall that the more important a policy is to your organization, the more incentive your organization has to ensure that the implementation is as simple and successful as possible. But if the policy is not important to your organization, then you have less incentive to make sure that it's simple. I mean, you can overcome a complicated policy implementation. If a policy itself is unimportant to your organization but very important to a competitor, in the case of being in a private sector, then your organization has a motivation or has an incentive to make the implementation process as complicated as possible. And that's simply because you want your organization to be completely successful at everything it does, but in a competitive market space like in the private sector, you have an incentive, your organization has an incentive to make the implementation difficult for your competitors, especially if it's not important to your organization. Now, there was a useful reference and checklist provided about concepts in policy analysis. I'd like you to make sure that you've reviewed this and are familiar with it before the exam, the final exam. Feel free to pause the video and read through each of these concepts. Okay. Now, some of the differences between education policy and other types of public policy are the scope, how broad it is, the complexity, how many moving parts are in it, how they relate to one another. Some of the decision environment is different. People have more input and more incentive to provide opinions about education policy than they do about other types of policies, some other types of policies. There are also many, many choices available in education policy, and that makes things more complicated. And the decision criteria are multifaceted. It's not usually a simple decision-making rubric that gets applied to education policies, because for every benefit there might be a different kind of drawback that weighs down a policy option until it's no longer a clear best choice. Now here's an example of some of the differences in policy scope. At the bottom you see that a narrow problem, a small problem, versus at the top of the left-hand column you have a substantial or broad problem. So the bigger the problems, the broader the policy scope needs to be. The smaller the problems, the simpler the policy scope can be. And that simply means that the bigger the problem, the more complicated the solution probably is. The smaller the problem, the simpler and more bite-sized the policy can be, and still solve the problem. And this is another way of putting it from the literature. The more complex the implementation process, the more likely the intent of the policy will become distorted or lost. This is an implication of what I just put in. If a policy itself is simple and easy, then the intended outcome is probably sustainable. But if the policy itself is complicated, if the implementation process is very complex, then it's possible that the intent of the policy becomes disconnected from what ends up being implemented at the end. That's not 100% true, but it is a risk factor for complicated policies. And this means that there's some incentive to create simple solutions, simple policies that are streamlined and do not have complicated implementation processes. continuing to look at the difference between policy scope, we went through all of these in class. Let me just pick out a couple of simple examples. Number of alternatives. When you're looking at a small issue-specific policy, there's not a need to have a high number of alternative solutions. A low number of solutions will probably provide a solution that is sufficient and strong enough to solve the policy problem. Whereas if you're looking at strategically important policy problems, then you probably need to look at a high number of alternatives to make sure that you've done enough research and you have strong enough due diligence to determine that you have the right solution among your alternatives. And you can see the difference between issue-specific and strategic level policies on all these different facets: complexity, decision environment, and decision criteria. So when we talked about the dimensions of policymaking, we drew a distinction between the rational and unitary actor who's thoughtful and decides based on internal reflection or self-contained reflection within an organization what a policy might be or what an appropriate policy might be. And we contrasted that with the way the public interacts with a different type of policy making. So where the public is involved, they have a self-interest and the organization has a self-interest, whether we're talking about an elementary school, a university, or a government agency like the Ministry of Education. They have a self-interest in the organization's perspective, and then the public has a perspective about their own self-interest, and those two things might not align. But nonetheless, this sort of represents an inclusive decision-making process where the public is involved versus an exclusive policy-making process where it's essentially an organization or a government agency that creates the policy on its own. It doesn't involve interaction between them and the public in great detail. And so when we go to look at the policymaking process, we see that the methodology we call incremental policymaking involves a policy being developed and then there being interaction and the policy is implemented, and then there is feedback, and that interaction with the real world leads to a revision of the policy. And this is typically an incremental improvement over a prior version. The way the policymaking process works in incremental policymaking is that you don't have one final version that you implement from the beginning and it's perfect the entire way. The idea is that you implement, you interact, and then you improve. Interact, implement, improve. So this process continues, and one of the reasons is that there are a lot of unknown variables in the policy making space, and you can't predict how a policy will work or fail in different ways, in every different way, that is. And so it's important to recognize the shortcomings of the policymaking process, and the incremental policymaking process allows for improvements and improvements and improvements. Now, one of the drawbacks is that before you arrive at a final version, it may take longer than arriving at a final version of a policy that was not enacted incrementally. Now, within the policymaking process, it's important to take the organizational leader's context into consideration. Now, what do I mean by context? You need to consider them and their personal interests, their professional career goals, how they understand a problem, both the merits of the problem and the challenges of the problem. Now, sometimes it works in contrast with the organizational goals And those two things sometimes overlap and they're nicely aligned. But you need to understand a little bit about the context of the leaders that will be implementing policy to understand what some of the risk factors might be about a weak implementation or a successful implementation. One way to look at that is to ask if the leaders themselves believe in the policy that is being enacted. If they don't believe in the policy itself, then that can cause friction that would perhaps undermine or reduce the success or the chances of success for a policy implementation. On the other hand, if you look at the organizations, one of the perspectives on organizations is that they are the underlying determinant of long-run performance of economies. So that's a vital role to play at a national level. And with respect to organizations, if they are trying to support a policy, they may have organizational self-interest in mind, but they may also be contributing to the long-term health of a national economy. According to the literature, it is conceivable that the organization's choices are in alignment over the long run with the economy's best interests. That doesn't mean that the short-run decisions are always aligned, but that in the long run there is some synergy between those two. Now, in terms of educational policy making, to bring it back to this narrower area of the policy making landscape, educational policy making has all of these characteristics. It is complicated. It's linked with socioeconomic structures. It relates to power and access and who has access to power. It's multifaceted, meaning that it has many different perspectives. The socio-political dimensions are complicated at least. And then education typically also influences wealth distribution within a country. So all of these factors are embedded in the education policy, whereas they might not all be embedded in other types of policy. And to be sure, other policies are not always easy. But education policy is particularly complicated, and it leads to the need for a balancing act, because different segments of society have different demands, and those are not always in balance with other segments of society with differing goals, objectives, and needs. So education is a very challenging place to make policy on a large scale, and even somewhat on a smaller scale inside of an organization. It can be quite challenging to balance the needs of different types of faculties within a school of education or within a university, for example. The School of Engineering may have different needs than the School of Education or the School of Engineering versus the School of Business. And so these are also at a more micro level, an organizational level, also examples of different segments of an organization that have different needs and demands. And so it continues to be a balancing act, even moving from the macro level to the micro organizational level.